relatively short passage set of verses, Moses is going to consider 7 types of cases that involves marriage. And these were things that some of them might seem a little strange to us today, but in that day and time, and from what I've understood from my reading, some of this stuff still goes on in the Far East today, or in the Middle East today, with the people who are over there. So I think you'll find that some of this stuff is pretty interesting, and did a lot of reading about it, and came up with some stuff I hope will be interesting to you. So before we go any further, I'd like for Kenny, if you would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Father in heaven, we want to thank you for this blessed day you gave us to come and study your word. Please believe you the one that's teaching, and be able to teach us the things that we need to know to take along with us in life. I thank you for your son who died on the cross.
Okay, so let's start out at verse 13 and go down to about verse 22. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and hates her, and makes shameful charges against her, and brings an evil name on her, and says, I took this woman, and when I came to her, I did not find her the tokens of virginity. Then shall the father of the girl and her mother take and bring tokens of the girl's virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. And the girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave my father to this man to wife, and he hates her. And lo, he has made shameful charges against her, saying, I have not found in her daughter the tokens of virginity. And yet these are the tokens of my daughter's virginity, and they shall spread the cloth before the elders of the city. And the elders of that city shall take that man and punish him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give them to the father of the girl, because he has brought an evil name on a virgin of Israel. And she shall be his wife, and he may not put her away in all the days. Now, the first verses that we're looking at here, we have a man who marries a woman, and then after the consummation of the marriage, he falsely accuses her basically of being a harlot. Actually, in some of the translations, it does say harlot, meaning she's not a virgin when he married her. So that the implication was that here was a promiscuous woman who was going around and doing things she shouldn't have been doing prior to the marriage. It's kind of interesting to note in all of the reading that I've done on this, we're not completely sure exactly what the meaning of the evidence was that the husband used to make this charge. None of the scholars seem to agree on this, but and really it's probably not important. But also, the people in that time who understood the law, they knew what it was, and no doubt they understood, what it was. Well, yeah, but along the same lines, it talks here about the tokens, and again here, whatever these tokens were, it was some type of infallible exhibit that the female was a virgin prior to the consummation of the marriage. Now, there's it talks about a cloth in the text, and this has been interpreted a couple different ways. And from what I've gathered from my reading, the way that they kind of came up with this was some of the practices that go on in the Middle East still until this day. One of the theories on this cloth is it's the sheet where they lay when they were consummating the marriage with the husband, that the parents would actually go and get the bed clothing from the first night of the marriage, and they would keep that that had the show of blood on it to be a witness of their purity in that situation. The other theory or possibility of this is that they would use as evidence the cloth where there was a menstrual period, and this would indicate that the girl was not that the girl was not pregnant. And from my reading, the Bedouins and the Muslim parents still to this day keep and retrieve this evidence and keep it to, and if necessary, to prove the virginity of their daughter. But this was perfectly possible in the case in these places. And the other thing that kind of seems foreign to us today is that it was not unusual for a 10, 12, or 14-year-old girl to be married back in that time, which is, in this day and time, that's something that we don't really hold to or we don't see a lot. But there was definitely a lot of involvement early in the marriage with the parents of the daughter. So what we're seeing here in these first verses is if the girl could prove her virginity, then her husband is going to have to pay a fine to the father for demeaning her in front of everybody. And the other penalty, he has to remain married to this girl. There's no divorce in this situation.
That seems more punishment to her than to him, though.
Well, yeah, maybe. So basically, this is kind of an indirect implication that God, at this particular time, did have situations where there could be a divorce, and we can read about this in the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy, and also the 24th chapter, which we haven't really gotten into. We really haven't gotten into yet, and but it's a pretty serious situation. The charges that the husband is making. So that the father we see here goes to the elders of the city at the gate, and we've talked about this before, that the gates to the cities or the gates to the town is where the elders and the leaders gathered, and it was kind of like I guess the equivalent we have now of a city hall. They didn't have a city hall, so you would go to the gates of the elders, and this is where civil matters, criminal matters, all the types of judicial appointments were taken care of. And according to the Talmud of Jonathan, there was 23 judges that was used in this particular situation because, and we're going to talk about this in the next section of verses, this was a very serious situation. Not only a situation where the father has made these accusations against the wife, but if he can prove that the wife wasn't a virgin in this situation, then we're talking about a situation where the wife had committed a capital crime. So this was not a situation that was taken lightly, and these 23 judges got together to consider the evidence. And really, when it comes right down to it, they were making a life or death decision in this situation. And a decision was going to have a long-term implication. So because of the seriousness of this here, this could not be heard in a lower court or what we might call a magistrate type court. This was one of the higher courts that was taken in. So the elders would get together. They would examine the evidence, and if they found in favor of the wife, then they were going to pronounce judgment against the man. They were going to charge, or they were going to fine him 100 shekels of silver, and that was going to be paid to the father for this malicious accusation that was made. And it's also interesting to note that this is twice as much as the seducer of a virgin would have to pay to the father for the reproach that he brought upon the daughter. So this is a pretty serious situation. And then lastly, he would not have the right to divorce the wife in this situation. Comments about those
100
verses?
shekels is about 2.5 pounds of silver.
Yeah, that's a buck or two. That's a buck or two. So there's the first situation that we're talking about where the husband made a false accusation against the wife, and it was proved to be a false accusation by the preponderance of the evidence. So now let's look at verses 20 and 21. But if this saying is true, and tokens of virginity are not found for the girl, then they shall bring the girl out to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her with stones, so that she dies, because she has done foolishness in Israel to play the harlot in her father's house. So you shall put evil away from among you. So here's the second situation that Moses is addressing in these verses that we're considering today, where we have a similar situation, but now the role is reversed. There is not proof, or the husband can prove, that the girl was not a virgin. So this being a capital offense, then she was going to be stoned to death there in the presence of all the town. So these verses kind of reveal the importance of the intimacy before marriage is sinful, and it's a serious problem in the sight of God, because we see here that, and we see this statement a lot. So shall put evil away from among you. That verse has gone all the way through Deuteronomy. We've seen it several times where these things were important and they need to be put away. So it was a serious situation, and I think everybody in that day and time understood it, because when people see the example of the punishment, it kind of leaves an impression. And nowadays, when there's a capital offense, we don't allow the public to come in and watch the execution. There may be a few witnesses or stuff like that. But in this time, in early days of our country, when there was an execution, it was a public event. Now, sometimes I understand that it got a little bit out of hand. I mean, selling candy and popcorn before the execution maybe got a little bit out of hand.
It turned into a social event.
Yeah, it really did. But the thing about it is, it made an impression. And I can't help but think back to one of the John Wayne movies, Chisholm. And the statement that one of the guys made, he says, "I witnessed a hanging one time that was ghastly," and I think that would be a good description of something like that. And things like that make an impression, not only on the older people, but it makes an impression on the younger people too. And sometimes it's not a bad thing for younger people to see the results of some of the actions that people take, and before they take those actions, they may think about it a little bit. I know that my kids growing up around the fire department, one of the things they learned was what stupid is, and they learned that sometimes being stupid could get you killed. And I know, especially with the boys, not quite as much Katie, but with the boys, both of them had the opportunity to be on a call where one of their classmates was killed, and it makes an impression on them. And that's not a bad thing. It makes them think. And here's the situation here where this thing was right out there in the public and made things think. Other comments about those verses. Okay, now let's look at verse 22, and this is the third case. If a man is found lying with a woman married to a husband, then they shall both of them die, the man that lay with the woman and the woman, so that you shall put away evil from Israel. So here in this third case, it's decreed that a man who is committing adultery with a married woman would die along with the woman. So basically, both of them are committing adultery, and both of them are going to, they're going to suffer the penalty. And again, it's a situation where this is not a mob rule situation. They would be brought before the elders. The evidence would be presented, and the elders would pronounce the judgment. And probably the standard way of taking care of this was stoning to death. And again, this would be a public situation, and pretty straightforward. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verses 23 and 24. This is the fourth case. If a girl who is a virgin is engaged to a husband, and a man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out of the gate of the city, and you shall stone them with stones that they die. The girl, because she did not cry out, and the man, because he humbled his neighbor's wife, so shall you put away evil from among you. So this basically deals with a situation where it's a man who had intercourse with a engaged girl in a city. Now, the Israelites regarded an engaged girl as virtually married. And there was we've talked about this before. It was a process. It's not like we do today where we have a marriage ceremony. There was a process here. And, once the process started, in the eyes of the Israelites, and in the eyes of the government, and in the eyes of God at that time, they were basically already married. So that's why we say here that the man is having intercourse with with the neighbor's wife. So thus they treated the man as having committed adultery in case, just like we talked about back there in case 3. In this case, however, the individuals involved would both die by stoning. The girl died because she did not cry out for help, which means that she consented, basically to the act. This was not a situation where she was forced into this situation. So she didn't fight back. Apparently, Moses was assuming that, if she cried out, then someone in the city would have heard her and came to her rescue. That was the assumption at the time, and like Bill said, she didn't fight back. So this was a consensual type of situation, and again, serious situation. They would have been brought before the elders, and the sentence would be pronounced, and they would die by stoning. Comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verse 25. But if a man finds an engaged girl in the field, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man that lay with her shall die. But if you shall do nothing to the girl, no sin worthy of death is in the girl, for as when the man rises against his neighbor and slays him, even so this is the matter. For he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was none there to save her. So here was a situation where the girl was out someplace, basically by herself, and she was attacked by a man. And the evidence shows that she did cry out, but there was nobody there to save her. So basically, she was forced into this situation. She was not a willing participant here in this case, and this is basically a case of rape. So it took place in an isolated field. In this instance, only the man is going to die, assuming the girl cried out for help, but there was no one there to hear her or to come in and intervene. So presumably, huh?
It's kind of hard to prove.
Right. Right. But yeah, again, they bring them before the elders, and the evidence is presented. So presumably, if it was clear that she did not cry out, then she would have been executed as well. And I would suspect probably they would go more with the physical evidence of, the beaten up and clothes torn, things along that line. Where if it was a consensual situation, those things probably weren't there. So, there's another situation that Moses dealt with. Comments about those verses. All right, let's look at verses 28 and 29. If a man finds a girl, a virgin not engaged, and lays hold on her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lies with her shall give the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. Because he has humbled her, he may not put her away all of his days. So here in this sixth case had to do with a man and a virgin who had intercourse, and they then before they were engaged. So it's a little bit different situation here than somebody, a stranger coming. There was some type of relationship, it looks here. So in this case, there was a payment of 50 shekels, which was half of what the other was, and then they had to marry, and there could not be a divorce in this situation. So there was a payment where the virgin was deflowered, and then there was a kind of I guess you would call it a shotgun wedding.
I'm going to say this is the ancient version of a shotgun wedding.
In a shotgun wedding, and that he gets to meet his new father-in-law in this situation. Yeah. So that brings us to verse 30, which is the seventh case here, and this is more of a general principle than anything else. A man shall not take his father's wife nor uncover his father's skirt. So Moses here, basically states in a general principle, God forbid incest in Israel. And this phrase here, uncovering the skirt, is kind of a euphemism for sexual intercourse that's used in the scripture. And do what?
New King James says bed.
Okay.
Covers father's bed.
Okay. Which would be a good interpretation. To do this means, encroachment on another person's marital rights, and that's what we're talking about here in this situation. One of the things that a comment that I found it in one of the commentaries I thought was very interesting, and it kind of pertains to what we're talking about, but it also kind of has a broader meaning. Now, I don't want to read this. It says, one of the most important and difficult tasks in the interpretation of the scriptures in general, and of the passages that deal with women and marriage in particular, is the need to discern which elements are cultural, temporary, and variable, and which ones are transcultural, timeless, and universal. And if you think about it, one of the situations that can cause a problem, especially for the preacher back there, is talking about marriage and divorce. Very, very, very difficult subject, and it can be a very touchy subject. And this is where the wisdom and the study of the Scripture and the proper application of the Scripture come. And I mean, I think we've seen here in these verses that this is something that God takes really serious. And there's a lot of ways that this thing can work, and God's laws are designed basically for monogamy, and unless it's in the marriage situation, and purity and fidelity are are essential in the well-being of society, and the family unit is very important to God. And it's think about it, it's very important to society. You look at the society today, and even the most liberal commentator will kind of say, hey, the breakdown of the family could be one of the problems that we're having with society today, all the crime and things like that. So I mean, God understands this situation a whole lot better than we do, and it was not His plan for these things to go on. And I think you can see here from some of the punishments here, this is a pretty serious situation that has to be taken into consideration. And God, people need to you need to keep sex in its proper place and in the relationship of marriage. I was thinking back, Bill and I several years ago got into the song Solomon. And that is basically a book that talks about the relationship between a man and a woman and the love between the two. I mean, God gives us everything that we need in the Bible to have a good life, and it's our job to read it and study it and apply those things. So I think we can say that the focus of this entire chapter that we talked about is talking about love and how to properly apply love.
The beauty of the concepts are that they've traveled well over time, they've traveled well geographically, and no matter where you go on this earth, no matter what religion these people might profess, these concepts are there.
Right. In every religion.
Every religion, every culture.
Changing verses, chapters here. Okay. Any other comments about the previous chapter? So now let's move into chapter 23. Now, in the preceding chapter, Moses talked about the proper types of marital union. In this chapter, he's going to set forth the proper types of unions of individuals with a covenant community. In other words, how people fit in to the general population of the children of Israel, and how he wants them to behave, and who he wants to include, and who needs to be excluded based on things that have happened. So this section of verses 1 through 8 deals with people who were not born in Israel, but who wish to worship publicly with full members of the nation. So we're going to talk a little bit here basically about proselytes and how they can get into the community, and ones that are not going to be eligible to be in the community. And God, I mean, He lays this out pretty distinctly in the teachings here. So I'm going to start out with verse 1, and I'm going to read 3 different translations of this verse, because I think each one of the translations kind of brings out a little bit more of the meaning. The first one that I want to read is from the modern King James Version, and it says, "He who is wounded, crushed, or who has his male member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of Jehovah." The King James Version says, "He that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord." And the American Standard Version says, "He that is wounded in the stones, or hath his privy member cut off, shall not enter into the assembly of Jehovah."
I'll give you a fourth version.
Okay. Okay.
"No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord."
No, I don't have any. I'll have to.
That's almost like New King.
That's on the New King James.
New King James too. Okay.
Are they talking about eunuchs here?
Basically.
Yeah.
That's what they're talking about. So basically, here is a situation where what happens here is not an accident. Okay, this is something that was done intentionally. And there's a huge difference here between something that happens accidentally that you don't have control over, and something that is done intentionally that you do have control over. And I mean, just from my feeble thinking is, I don't think it would be right for God to hold against somebody something that they had no control over. Okay, but in what we're talking about here is a situation there is control in this situation, and this person had control over what was going to, happen. So it was not done accidentally.
They're talking about people from other kingdoms can come across proselytes, but eunuchs, like in the foreign courts, is that it? I mean,
Well, not exactly. Well, let's work our way through this because we're going to start looking at different examples, okay? And that's going to make a difference to what comes in here, okay? So basically, we're talking about an accident where by the hands of men and with design this was done, and by doing this, it's going to make that person unfit to be in the assembly of the congregation. And obviously, we're talking about here about castration, but then the other part of it is they had their private member cut off. Either they did it themselves or somebody else did it for them, and then we get to the situation where there's a unit that was done by the hands of men. So God in this situation excludes eunuchs from public worship because of their lack of wholeness, being kind of a symbolize of their lack of holiness. Now, again, we've got to keep in mind we're talking about ones from other nations and things along that line. Also, I think it's important that we talk a little bit about congregation and assembly. Okay. The word in the original text was Gahal, Gahal, and in some translations it's translated assembly. In some, it's translated congregation. But what we're talking about is a very broad meaning here, not only in the formal worship in the tabernacle and the formal worship of God, but also in the community festivals and occasions and the feasts and stuff that went along with the Jewish religion at this particular time. So not only were they excluded from public worship, but they were also excluded from all the festivals and everything else because God did not want these people intermingling with His people because of the bad influence that this could cause, especially on the ones that were weak. And if you think about it, the people who are most susceptible to getting off the rails are not the ones who are strong in the faith. It's the ones who are weak in the faith. Those are the ones that are most vulnerable, and those are the ones that God was concerned about. He wasn't concerned about Moses. He wasn't concerned about Joshua or any of them. They weren't going to pull stuff like this. Okay, he was worried about the weaker ones that may get in a situation like this, and pointing out to them the importance of this thing to happen. So we're talking about pretty much a total exclusion from most of the things that have to do with with the religious life of the people in that time. They were not allowed to hold an office. They were not allowed to marry an Israeli or an Israelite woman. I mean, they were pretty much excluded from admission to anything that had to do with the covenant fellowship that Israel had with God, because they had mutilated basically the nature of man that God had created, and this was something that God would just not reconcile. That was not something He approved of, and it was not reconcilable with the character that He wanted His people to have. Comments about that verse?
I haven't looked at it very far, Dave, but I'm not sure that you can, and maybe some of the commentaries you read do say this. I'm not sure that you can say that somebody that has had this done by accident or on purpose doesn't fit these qualifications. Meaning, it's obvious that somebody that has done this to themselves is not fit to do this somebody that's had this done accidentally, I'm not so sure that we can say that they also aren't excluded, only because if you go back to Leviticus 22 and 24, where it talks about the things that they were to offer,
Mm-hmm.
They were not allowed to offer something that was bruised or disfigured or other things like that. So, like I said, I haven't really looked at it. So,
Well, and I mean, I spent a lot of time on this particular verse, and you're right, it's not real clear. And especially when you go back and you look at some of the examples of some of the other people in the Bible that are prominent, they kind of meet some of these criteria. And later on, and I did read, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, where this seemed to be a short-term deal as they were moving into the promised land, because later on these things happened. There were eunuchs that were involved in the deal, and it's just like when we talk here in the next verse, we're going to talk about an illegitimate child. Okay, you read it here one place, and it looks like they're completely excluded for any way, and then later on in the scriptures, you'll see where they were. They played a prominent role. So I mean, I'm sure they understood this at the time, but these are some pretty tough verses sometimes to interpret in some of this stuff, and that goes back to that statement I made before. Sometimes this stuff is pretty tough.
We don't know. I don't think it ever comes out to tell us that everybody has supposed that Daniel, his friends, were eunuchs. So that they were prominent people.
Right. And I mean, and there's a couple other ones that we won't talk about.
I'm gonna say this.
We'll talk about a little bit later that met this criteria that were, key people in the Bible. So I think we'll stop here. The clock on the wall is wrong, and my clock says it's time to quit. So we'll pick up with verse 2 next week, and everybody study this stuff really hard the next week, and help me out here.
A lot of the scholars don't like to about it. Well, you have to remember.
And I tell you what,
They're moving to the promised land.
yeah.
It's God's goal to multiply the nation. So those people. The one I'm going to mention, I'll mention next week, was Abraham and Hagar.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is post-Abrahamic.
Well, okay, baby. Yeah.